Diesel is surprisingly dirty.
I guess that's really hard for a customer because they'll never know.
In lubricants, 1 + 1 = 3.
All right, guys, I know it's been ages, but we're here today with another podcast. Stay tuned. Today, we have a really cool guy on. His name's Rafe Britton. Rafe has been working with us to develop an oil for Just Autos. Now, we have been analysing all the data for the 300 series, and a lot of different vehicles have been gathering over the last few months. So this is why it's taken some time to put this video together. But in today's podcast, we're going to answer a lot of your questions, debunk some common questions that get asked, and really give you an insight into what we're trying to achieve for you guys. All right, welcome, Rafe. Pleased to have you here. Appreciate you taking some time and to speak to us about all these subjects. I guess first things first is I don't know much about what you actually do, and I really want to learn a bit more about it. So can you tell us first off what you actually are professional in and what you expert with the oil and everything else, and give us a bit of a rundown into all of that would be a great starting point, I reckon.
Yeah, easy. So I'm a lubrication specialist, I guess is how you'd describe it.
Yep.
So there's no kind of formal job title or anything like that. Lubrication engineer is what I was in sort of a former life.
Yes.
And predominantly my specialty is actually industrial lubricants. So some people would have heard of Lake Speed Junior. So a lot of
definitely
people
have seen him on YouTube in bits and pieces. Yep.
Yeah, so he kind of describes himself as the motor oil geek.
Yep.
Lake's a good mate of mine, and so I'm kind of like his equivalent for the industrial side. So I'm the industrial oil geek.
Yep.
So my background goes, I had some time where I worked at Mobil on the lubricant side of the business, and I went out on my own about 3.5 years ago as an independent consultant.
Yep.
So I would do things like, well, there's two halves of the business. One is I help work with oil companies.
Yep.
On things like training their people, coming up with new formulations, new products, and that sort of side of the business. And then the other side of the business is working with people who use lubricants. So that's mining companies, oil and gas companies, power generation, food manufacturing. Basically anything that moves requires lubricant. Yep. And there's a whole kind of area which is about how do we optimize people's lubricant strategy, because as I'm sure we'll talk about, lubricants are this essential component of machine reliability. So there's all these stats out there where, SKF, the bearing manufacturer, will say it's probably about 80% of bearing failures are attributable in some way to the lubricant.
Lubrication, yeah.
Yeah. Vickers would say roughly 80% of hydraulic system failures are down to contamination of the hydraulic oil.
Yeah.
So it's this really important component, but very few people kind of understand lubricants and lubrication, and that's kind of where I fit in.
Yeah, that's cool. So I guess first question would be, what is engine oil? Okay, because for the people that don't know, we top our engines up with oil and we change oil, but what is it and what do we use it for?
Yeah, great question. So from the very beginning, so engine oil is the lubricant which enables the engine, I guess, to move without seizing.
Yeah.
Right, so there are any number of machine parts which require lubricant to run. So let's say, for example, like a door hinge. Most people's experience of like a lubricant is using WD-40 on a door hinge or something like that, right?
Works really well.
Yeah, works really well. Interestingly, WD-40 is kind of the opposite of a lubricant. That's a whole nother story. But basically, because the door hinge has such, it's operating at relatively low speeds and low loads and all that sort of stuff, it doesn't require a huge amount of lubricant, right? Engine oils, on the other hand, completely essential, right? The engine would fail catastrophically basically within seconds if you tried to run them completely dry. And in many cases, they probably wouldn't even start because the amount of friction inside the engine wouldn't enable them to move. So when we look at engine oils, we're really trying to accomplish a number of things. So one is to reduce friction. Number two would be to reduce wear. Mm-hmm. Number three is prevent corrosion. And the fourth one is really as a heat transfer medium.
Yeah, that's the one that I've always looked at and it's a big thing.
Yeah, definitely. So in terms of reducing friction, obviously the slipperiness of the oil, right? Yep. Reducing wear, the oil viscosity, so the thickness of the oil, right, is what helps to separate machine parts from each other, right? So you can imagine trying to sandwich two metal plates together. If you had put honey between those plates, it's actually difficult to squish them together, right? And so that viscosity is the key. That's what's giving us the separation.
Viscosity, just to take away from what is oil, but viscosity, obviously ratings on bottles, they range in a lot of numbers, but what do they actually mean? Because people get so confused about what a 0-20 means. And what does the 0 mean? What does the 20 mean? It would be really good to explain that.
Yeah, great. So let's start with a 0W20.
Yeah.
Right. So W stands for the winter grade of the oil.
Yeah.
So you can think of the first number as being the cold temperature performance of the oil. The second number is like the high temperature performance of the oil.
Yeah.
Now, why do we have two different grades? Think about at engine startup. Your oil is cold and the engine is mostly dry.
Yeah.
So what we want in an ideal world is we want an engine that's really, really thin, because thin oils will flow very quickly.
Yeah.
So it'll mean that on engine startup, the oil will pump all the way around all the oil galleries up to your top end, your cams and everything, and it will make sure that everything is protected as quickly as possible, because a lot of wear occurs at engine startup.
Yeah,
right?
for sure.
When the engine's dry. But then once we get up to temperature, once something is hot, in an ideal world, what we want is actually something which is nice and thick, right? Which can then separate those metal components and stop them from wearing against each other. Unfortunately, Mother Nature gives us the exact opposite of what we want. So if you've ever heated up honey, right, in a pan or something like that, you'll notice that it thins out at high temperatures.
Definitely, it's the opposite, yeah.
You put it in the fridge, it gets really thick. So it's the exact opposite of what we want. And so when we talk about viscosity, there's the cold temperature performance and then the sort of the high temperature performance.
Yeah. Probably the other thing that people talk about, and I see it a lot, especially in the 300 series with a lot of, emission control devices on cars, with DPFs and so forth, is the C rating. Can you explain what the C rating is for and what that's all about? Because it's something that comes up quite regularly. I get asked the question a lot, so I'd like you to explain to everyone what it's all about.
Yeah. So I think you're probably talking there about like a ASEA C2 or a ASEA C3 or something like that, right? Yeah. So that is the ASEA classification for the engine oil. What is that? Who is ASEA? So ASEA is an association of automotive, basically engine manufacturers that comes out of Europe. So ASEA is actually a French acronym. Don't ask me what it stands for, but it's made up of people like Stellantis, but actually even non-European brands like Toyota, because they have manufacturing presence in Europe.
Yep.
And these are the guys that kind of set the ground rules for what is the minimum requirements for different kinds of oils.
Yep.
Right? And they have a variety of different ratings. So some people will have seen, for example, on some passenger cars, ASEA, let's say A3B4 or A5B5. Those oils have what we call higher rates of SAPs, which is sulfated ash, phosphorus, and sulfur. It's a fancy word for, if I burn the oil, what's the residual ash that remains afterwards? And we're okay in a lot of cars to have decent amounts of ash. Where we run into trouble with ash is that reactive phosphorus and sulfur compounds that are in the oil will bind actually to catalytic converters and will kind of make them inert. And so that's why it's an easy way to remember. ASEA C stands for ASEA C for catalyst friendly, right? So those oils have lower levels of SAPs.
Yep.
Right, so then you get into C2, C3, C4, C5, etc. And what's the differences between those two? So let's say, for example, the difference between C2 and C3. Those two classifications are almost identical, except for one property, which is called the HTHS viscosity. Another viscosity term, right?
Yeah.
So we already talked about 0W20.
Yes.
Right? HTHS viscosity is tested at a higher temperature, so it's tested at 150 degrees, and under high shear conditions. So they place it inside a little rotor and they spin something to create high shear while testing the viscosity at 150 degrees. And it's supposed to mimic basically interactions like between the cams and the lifters, right, where you would have high temperature, high shear conditions. Now, that viscosity gives you, first of all, protection at the cams and the lifters, but also more viscosity in those areas will require more fuel consumption, right, because we are working against the viscosity. Mm-hmm. So if you compared C2 to C3, C2 has a lower requirement for HTHS viscosity. So it is theoretically a more fuel efficient version.
Yep.
Yeah.
So that's the only real difference there is really that. It's funny, a lot of people get really set on the C rating of the oil, and it's something that I've seen several times. But when you start to dive into all the different, components of an oil, it's, they say oils ain't oils, and it's so true because there's so many things to it. I think probably the next thing is we need to establish is we know what the oil does and bits and pieces there, but what do you start with as far as we know it's something we get out of the ground, it's a crude oil, and then what is added to that as far as, say, an ad pack goes? And I guess people, believe that it comes out of the ground, it gets washed, cleaned, and it comes out. But what are we adding to that? What is that we're adding to it, and what are the reasons around some of that? And I know it's different for every application for marine and industrial and everything else, but let's just say it's motor vehicles and such. Can you just give us a brief description on that?
Yeah, good question. So basically, everything that comes out as crude oil, which then gets refined, that basically is referred to as the base oil.
Yeah.
So think of that as like the carrier, right? So it makes
the
up
body
about
of it.
Yeah, it makes up about 80% of the total volume of an engine oil.
Yes.
And it gives it most of its viscosity properties. Remember, viscosity is the most important component of the oil, right? It does most of the work. The other 20% is made up of what we call additives. So because you're adding them to the base oil. And in our world, that's like KFC's 11 secret herbs and spices, right?
It's a secret recipe.
Yeah, it's kind of a secret recipe, but it also, the reason we use them is because it helps to cover deficiencies in the base oil.
Yeah.
Right. So let's say, for example, if I were to create a recipe, I'd start with my base oil. If I just have the base oil, the first thing that I need to do is I need to protect the oil against something called oxidation. Oxidation is a fancy word for cooking of the oil. Just like oil in a fry pan,
boiling it off.
Yeah, it'll cook and form deposits.
Yep.
Same thing will happen in the oil, so we want to protect against that. We use these things called antioxidants, right? Then the other thing that we want to do is prevent corrosion. Now, we're not very imaginative in our line of work. So corrosion inhibitors is what they're called. They inhibit corrosion, right?
Okay, yep.
So if you get water into the crankcase or whatever, it'll help stop that. Other stuff that goes in, anti-wear additives.
Yeah.
Everyone's probably, well, not everyone, but a lot of people will be familiar with zinc as an anti-wear additive. Zinc is the common name for something called ZDDP, which actually stands for zinc dialkyl dithiaphosphate.
That's pretty complicated.
Yeah. So ironically, with ZDDP, the zinc actually doesn't do anything. So even though all these oil companies are advertising, we've got 1,500 parts per million zinc, 2,000 parts per million zinc, the zinc doesn't do anything. It's the phosphorus and a bit of sulfur, which is the active ingredient.
Do you think it's because of the name? If you said, zinc seems to be like a fancy name for maybe protection and so forth, thinking like sunscreen and bits and pieces.
Yeah.
Do you think that's the marketing pull that they push towards?
Yeah,
that?
I think it's simple, it's easy for people to get and all that sort of stuff, right?
Yeah.
And there's this conception that, more is better,
yeah.
right? If zinc is the anti-wear, so it protects my metal surfaces, well, more should be better, right?
Yeah.
But that's where we have to be a bit careful on our side is there's ample evidence that suggests above about 1,400 parts per million, it starts to become corrosive. And so, again, more is not always better. It's about finding that balance in the formulation.
I think it was something that I found was really interesting when I was looking at more like marine applications in diesels and so forth. And it was like anti-foaming agencies and then detergents in there as well, especially with the moisture buildup. And it's funny how the oils were, made for a particular application. It wasn't the saying that you couldn't run a oil in that particular engine, but for long term to get the most out of that, it was those ad packs that were really helping those oils. I've got a question that how does an oil, so from a base point of view, it comes out the ground, is it a set viscosity or is it random that it comes out? And how do you get it? Like, do they, I know it sounds silly, but do they water it down to make a viscosity thinner? Like, how do they get there? Like, is that something that comes out as a 140 and you blend it with something else and it becomes half its, viscosity? How do you get it thinner?
Good question. So when crude oil comes out of the ground,
Yep.
like just a barrel of oil,
Yep.
there's all sorts of different stuff in there. So what they do, the first step of the refining process is something called atmospheric distillation. That's a really fancy word for they boil the whole thing.
Yes.
And every different component that's in the crude oil will boil at different temperatures.
Yep.
Right. So as an example, methane. right, as a gas, it's already boiled, right? So it comes out the top.
Yep.
Whereas something really heavy, like bitumen, will come out the bottom.
Yep.
So they're able to kind of take these different cuts. So, petrol, diesel, kerosene, and then probably some of the lubricating oils fall in that region. So they make different base oils from them.
Yep.
Some will be lighter, some will be heavier, and then we blend them together to get the exact viscosity that we want.
Right, so it's a bit random, and that's how you get it, by changing, obviously, with what it's been refined out of it and blending those refineries together.
Yeah.
It was interesting you talk about like asphalt, and I think it's amazing what comes out of a barrel of oil and all the different sort of, components that are made from plastics, all sorts of stuff that come off it. But something I found later, which is a little bit different to oil, but was diesel, and seeing a lot of build-up in diesel filters that are in common rail cars that have an extremely high return fuel temperature, which is exceeding 100 degrees, and that would split the diesel in like a refinery process, and that black build-up that you get in your filter is actually asphalt, and that's where I found it was quite interesting that, depending on where you got your fuel and stuff like that, some would be worse than others, but something that, it's probably not really relevant to oil, but again, understanding that that's where the refinery process comes from with oil.
Diesel is surprisingly dirty.
Yeah.
Right. So most of the time we think of it as when it gets poured out,
because it's clean.
It should be relatively clean. And in fact, when you put it into a jerry can or something, it looks clean, right?
Yeah, definitely.
The problem with contaminants in diesel as well as in lubricants is actually the most dangerous stuff is of a size that is invisible to the human eye. So something might look perfectly clean, but it can be still damaging to the engine.
Yeah, interesting.
So think about like the nozzle on your diesel injectors, right? You've seen how fine those things are.
Yeah, definitely.
So it doesn't take very large contaminants to plug those. And as soon as you start getting plugging of the diesel injectors, right, that spray pattern isn't quite as perfect.
Yep.
You don't get complete combustion, and it leads to all sorts of problems.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess that, again, building oils, you've got to build an oil in that sort of counteracts a lot of these things. There was something else that you mentioned to me, which I never even thought of, was, in a combustion processes that there's acidic acids that are left over that enter the sump and so forth, and it can attack the oil. And there's all those sorts of things that I hadn't even thought of. Like, I just thought of oil as oil, and then you see all these other elements that are attacking it. So you can sort of see why oil is getting it's the brunt force, and everything is trying to kill it basically and bring it down. So you can see why changing it regularly is definitely a positive. Some questions about, debunking some questions a lot of people ask. Probably one of the biggest ones is that people get so brand orientated. It's nearly like football teams. They love their brand and they stick on it. But I guess the question is, people ask a lot is, can they mix a brand of oil with another brand of oil? And is that a problem for them?
Yeah. So in general, brand is not the issue, right? So if you were to mix, let's say a Castrol and a Mobil product, right? If they're in the same viscosity grade and they conform to the same specifications, most of the time you're going to be able to do that with no issues.
Yes.
Right? The issue is more if we then deviate. So if I'm mixing a Castrol 5W30 and a Castrol 15W40, that's when we tend to run into issues, right? Or if I'm mixing an oil that's designed for, petrol engines with no catalytic converters with something that's designed for diesel engines with catalytic converters and DPFs, right?
For sure.
And so that's when we can run into issues, yeah.
Do you find that, this is just globally thinking about, if the manufacturers are manufacturing oil, the two different brands, they're still making requirements, but say one oil is a lot cheaper, and it could be for various reasons. Are they able to make the product, cheaper by still meeting the requirements, but being at the lower end of that? Is that possible to do? Like, can they do that? Is that
great question.
Obviously, we're up the upper end with what we're doing, but can they be at the lower end?
Yeah, definitely. So let's say, for example, API SP, right?
Yes.
That's SQ has just been released this month. That really, all it does is set the minimum performance bar, right? So you can either just clear it, or you can massively clear it, right? So it's really up to the manufacturer of whether they want to just meet the kind of the specification, or they want to do their customer a solid and exceed the spec.
I guess that's really hard for a customer because they'll never know, because that's all, I guess, the magic secret recipe that goes in the oil, and only when you analyse the oil you'll really know that. So I've heard this third party, but basically it was an apprentice of mine who told me his auntie was using canola oil in her car for a long time because she didn't know the difference between engine oil and canola oil, right? And I know that sounds quite funny, but it was drinking it like it was going out of fashion. So I don't really know the weight of what canola oil was. I was surprised the car still functioned. Apparently it had a unique smell, and I'm sure it would have. But it just goes to show that putting oil in it with no oil is still better than nothing. You know what I mean? Because it's still a lubrication to some degree. I guess the question is, and I guess maybe I've answered this myself already, but if a customer was, say, in the middle of the desert and they found that oil was low and they're like, hey, I really want to top it up, but all they had was a petrol oil or, an oil viscosity that wasn't quite what they had. Would it be better? I mean, it's hard, and I don't want you to say you can do that, but would you be better to put and top the car up with, say, a litre of oil just to get them by to then be able to get that change at, say, the next town or whatever? Is that something that you would advise to do?
Yeah, good question. So in that instance, right, it is a little bit circumstantial, right? Because let's say, like, how low is the oil, right? As in, so if we've got, let's say, a 5 litre sump, and we've only lost half a litre, no, don't worry about topping up with something else.
We're good, yeah.
But if we're about to run dry, like you said, any oil is better than no oil at all.
Yeah.
And it's funny that you talk about canola oil as an example. I mean, where does castor oil get its name from? If you say it like a Brit, you say castor oil. Castor oil is where castor oil actually gets its name from.
Yeah, right.
So the early lubricants were mostly plant-based, right? Whether it's castor oil, rapeseed, all sorts of these. And in fact, a lot of these products are still used. Like palm oil is still used to make aviation jet turbine fluids.
Yeah.
So they will lubricate.
Yep.
It's just that a lot of the vegetable or natural products simply won't last as long, and they might not be the exact viscosity grade that you are looking for.
There you have it. One of the last questions that we get asked a lot is, by changing my oil from a 020 to a 530, will it affect my warranty? And it's a hard question to answer because I think it comes down to the manufacturer and their recommendations. A lot of the oil videos I've done in the past have been based on what Toyota have recommended in their handbook, and so that's what I follow. And I still suggest to this day to anyone that asks these questions about what oil I should run, I still believe that they should be following the manufacturer's handbook. I think that's probably the best bet. Would you probably agree with that?
Yeah. In general, especially if you're within the warranty, right? Then manufacturer's handbook is going to be sort of your go-to.
Yeah.
Once you go beyond the warranty, it's very much a buyer beware kind of situation, right?
For sure.
You can start playing in your own sandbox, but it's going to be on you.
Yeah, definitely. So I think that's pretty important. If people are looking at that, and I think following the handbook would be the best move forward for them. Talking about oils, and we wanted to have you on this podcast today to really talk about the 300 series in general, some of the oil speculation. I think it's probably best to touch base on maybe some of the oil analysis that we've done on the 300 series we've collected so far, and also to do with the 020. I think there's a lot of we did a video that we released, and we got a lot of kit back from that from a lot of people. I think the biggest thing that we're trying to look at is the oil from, say, a 520 to or a 020 to a 530. A lot of our high load applications, and making sure that is the correct oil for the consumer to be putting in their vehicles. So.
Yeah. Okay, so let's step back a little bit and look at sort of like oil analysis and what the purpose is, right? So oil analysis is a little bit tricky because it's not like a continuous monitoring exercise, right? So let's say, for example, if you're measuring oil temperatures or oil pressures, that's a continuous feedback loop that happens, and you can download that data usually and see almost on a second by second basis how the engine's performing. Oil analysis is more like a snapshot in time, right? Now, there are some actual continuous oil monitoring systems that are on the market, but they're mostly for really high-end, like gas turbines. You've got a $50 million asset. You want to tell what the oil's doing in real time. So that's what makes it difficult, is you only get this sort of single snapshot
to see what's happening. Yeah, get that.
Yeah. Now, as an example with silicon, right? So silicon presents for any number of reasons, and it's kind of on us to intuit, well, where could the silicon have come from? So first of all, right, silicon can come from the additive package, right? So silicon derivatives, and polymethacrylates are generally what we call anti-foam additives. So you can imagine there's a whole bunch of churn, whether it's in engine oils or driveline fluids.
Yep.
And we're trying to kind of tamp down that foam.
Yep.
Because obviously air is a terrible lubricant, and as it gets sucked into the pumps and
Cause
ends up,
cavitation, all sorts of problems.
yeah, we can have cavitation, and simply if air is somewhere where oil is supposed to be, you're going to get a collapse of that protection, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So that's one area where silicon is really common, but it's generally in very, very small quantities. So when you detect it, it's kind of in that maybe 5 to 10 part per million type range.
I found that with the oil testing that we sort of analysed and went through, and like I'm no expert, but I went through and I was analysing. I think we've got probably 10 cars in that sort of listing and just having a look at what goes on. The good thing out of all those cars, I didn't really have any bearing problems or anything like that. There was no high metal or anything like that. But the silicon was varied between them, which I thought was quite interesting and why that'd be the case. But I did see a lot of the notes from a lot of the oil tests saying that they believe that could be to induce, obviously, silica from, dirt and sand and dust and so forth, which in these cars were brand new. So it was very unlikely that would be the case. But I can see how you can be misled down a track by just looking at it through one sort of glass or one set of eyes and having a look at it.
Yeah, definitely. So one other thing to note as well with the oil test results is that whenever you get recommendations that are listed there, they are, let's say, automatically generated recommendations. So there's kind of an algorithm that sits in the background which says this plus this makes this recommendation. So they're going to be quite generic in nature. And that's why they often don't hit the mark, right? Because they don't, for example, understand that this is a brand new engine. Highly unlikely that we've got huge dust ingress.
Yeah,
right?
for sure.
What they will generally see is silicon, and the general rule is silicon plus a little bit of aluminium means dirt. So what we find in most oil analysis results is the kind of the ratio between silicon and aluminium varies between like 2:1 and 12:1, depending on what location you're in the world.
Yeah.
That generally points to dirt. Yep. So if they see anything within those proportions, they'll automatically flag it as dirt ingress. Hey, check the air filters
check these
or
rules.
whatever.
Yeah.
Without knowing kind of more context or more background behind the oil analysis result. Now there's a bunch of other areas where silicon can also derive from, right? So, silicon sealants would be a good example. Or, as you kind of pointed out, sand castings as well. So that is a possible ingress point. Now, it's a little bit hard to be definitive about it. But once you narrow out, okay, it can't be dirt because these are new engines, it's unlikely to be the anti-foam package because it's present in higher quantities.
Yep.
Then it's sort of, you start to narrow down to what it could possibly be.
Yeah, I noticed that we actually sent off one of the samples to a couple other labs, and it's funny, they give back similar results, but it's still varied as well. So it does show that the testing it's hard to really grab that data and be 100% on it. It's sort of like you said, a snapshot in time. It's a pinch of salt. You just sort of go, okay, well, this is roughly where we're going through. And I'm sure there's some key things you look at. I guess the question is probably the biggest question that everyone sort of asks is, we did a video about the 020 and Toyota State, and a lot of other manufacturers do in high load applications that we see in Australia, especially with temperatures that are recommended to go to a 530 oil, and that's their recommendation. We currently run a 540 oil with a lot of the cars we do, purely because from a performance aspect, where we're running the engines at a hotter temperature, as well as pushing these things, we need more protection. So that's why we went to the 540 oil. But can you give us a bit of an understanding around the 020 oil, maybe what the manufacturer was trying to achieve by running the 020, and gives a bit of an understanding of that, because I think a lot of people are lost in that.
Okay. So again, there's a lot of context for this.
Yes.
And it's got a lot to do with, there's regulation, there's also advances in the type of materials that we're using in engines.
Yes.
And a lot of it is in the pursuit of fuel economy, right? So I think there's a tendency for everyone to kind of put the tinfoil hat on and say, they're wanting to reduce engine life. That's going to cause you to be a repeat customer, right?
Yeah.
As an example.
Yeah.
I think the pressure comes more from kind of governments around the world.
Like emissions, you mean?
Yeah, it's mostly emissions. So just to wind back, go back to the early 2000s.
Yes.
Right? So if anyone's familiar with the API categories, so if you look on your oil bottle, you'll see something like API SP certified.
Yes.
Right? If it's a diesel engine oil, it'll be API CK4 is the most current update. So what is that? So API is the American Petroleum Institute, right? And that's made up from mostly American oil manufacturers. So it's the Exxon Mobils, the BP Castrols, the Shells of the world, right? And they actually kind of write up best practices for all kinds of aspects of the petroleum industry, including oils for vehicles. Okay. Now, what happens is, effectively, governments of the world set emissions targets, right? And in the early 2000s, there was a very strong focus on bringing down NOx that comes out of the tailpipe, so NOx, right? So all the nitrogen compounds, as well as particulate matter. So that's basically soot. And if you look at the API C class, so they went from, CG, CH, CI, CJ, CK, right? That's how they kind of go by letters of the alphabet. What you found was that the box of allowable NOx and particulate matter kept getting smaller and smaller.
Yeah, harder to meet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So think about changes to your diesel engine over the years, right? Once upon a time, diesel engines were relatively simple, right, and relatively reliable objects. And then we just started adding all this jewelry to it, right? So
totally,
to bring NOx down, it's exhaust gas recirculation,
DPS,
it's AdBlue systems, particulate matter, we're putting in the DPF systems. So all of that complexity gets added to the engine.
100%, yeah.
Now, that then gets punted to the oil companies, right, who effectively are left holding the bag, so to speak, right?
Yes.
Because it's, hey, we've developed this engine, now make it reliable. Right? And so that's how the oil specifications are then developed is, okay, now we've got this technology, how can we make it last? And that's really what the oil technologies are about. Okay. Now, at some point around, call it about 2016, where the last round of specifications came in, if you look at how much NOx and particulate matter is coming out of the tailpipe, it's exceedingly small. So we've kind of like squeezed that lemon for all it's worth. And so now it's, well, what else is coming out of the tailpipe? It's only CO2. The only way you can reduce CO2 is reduce the amount of fuel that's burnt. So that's why everyone's chasing fuel economy now.
So parasitic losses with, you can see everything from alternators to aircon units to everything else and how they're trying to do, variable speeds on everything and really try and reduce the load on the engine.
So everything is like stop-start now, right? Everything is small engines that are all turbocharged, direct injection,
hybrid systems,
all of that sort of stuff has come in as a result of these fuel economy mandates, right? So the lubricant then has to follow suit. Okay. Now, just think of it at a very basic level. Stuff that's thick requires more energy to move. So if you put honey in your engine, that's really difficult to move against. Stuff that's thin flows really easily. And so there is an obvious reason for why you would want to decrease the oil viscosity. You gain back probably, let's say, for example, if you go between a 15W40 and a 5W30, you probably gain in the ballpark of about 1.5% on fuel economy, which doesn't sound like a lot, but over an entire global fleet,
can make a big difference.
That's
for sure. Big numbers make big difference.
And that's what they're chasing.
So from a car point of view, obviously going back to the 0-20, as a customer, I look at myself and what I would want. I'm really looking at trying to protect my investment for long term, and that's probably one of the biggest things that our customers are looking for is making sure that they're protected as they travel and they don't have these concerns or problems. We only have these cars for a short term while they're in warranty, but once they're out of warranty, we're carrying everything else, and I think it's really important to know we've got the right, information and the right things we're doing with these cars moving forward. So do you believe that, the 0-20 obviously has a place, like there's no two ways around. I think with the cars in their sort of standard form with everyday driving, sure, that'll probably be completely fine. But with the cars that we are seeing with the towing effort, is it pretty important to go to a 530? Like, is that something that you believe is the right thing to do? Or?
Yeah, good question. So personally, yes, right? I would be going to a 530 in some of the more heavily loaded applications like towing capacity, right? I think if you looked across most of like the SUV market in Australia, and I don't have data to show this is anecdotal at this point, right? So I would say, SUVs have kind of become family cars in some respects. So if you're just using the car to go and pick up the kids from school, drive them to practice or whatever, there's probably an argument that 0W20 is enough. But it's as soon as you start putting load on the back, that's really sort of extending the engine a little bit further. And it makes sense that there's going to be more load on the engine, more load on the engine components. And the primary defense that we have against engine wear is oil viscosity. Right? So thicker oils give you more film strength and more protection.
Yes.
And I think it's logical that at least a 530 would make sense.
So obviously, for our own personal cars, my cars and so forth, I run a 540. That's where I run that. But understand that the cars that we are seeing on a daily basis are not standard vehicles anymore. And I don't ever expect those customers to go back to Toyota with, sort of warranty claims and bits and pieces. But our cars that are running, say, that were a 020 are now a 540. I guess the biggest question is that, do I see a fuel consumption difference? I can't even measure it. It's so small, I can't notice the difference. It's something that I've tried to see if there's any difference. I've even done horsepower between like a 020 stuff. Yeah, there possibly could be maybe a couple of horsepower, but it's still debatable. It's so hard to measure.
Yeah, so I've run large-scale fleet trials,
trying
to look at this kind of thing, right?
Yep.
So with bus companies and truck companies and things like that, and you can look at, let's say, for example, in heavy-duty diesel engines going from a 1540 to a synthetic 530, right? It is very, very difficult to see the changes in the data. And the primary reason for that is the driver's right foot is going to make way more of a difference than any changes that we're making in the oil viscosity, right? So there's just too much variation, whether it's traffic conditions, weather conditions, and the driver's right foot. That's going to dominate your fuel economy way more than it is just tweaking the oil viscosity by a little bit. So I totally agree that for most people's purposes, you're not going to see that number. Now, when oil companies prove out these numbers, when they show a 1 to 1.5% improvement in oil economy, they are doing that in unbelievably controlled conditions. So, for example, there is a well-known test track in the UK where they'll set up trucks and literally drive them on a predefined circuit, right, with a professional driver who is trying to replicate his movements as much as possible. And they'll do that over days to get sufficient data so that they can prove those differences. Or they'll have to do it on, engine dynos and things like that. I think in the real world, you're just never going to see the difference.
And I guess that begs the differ. I think a lot of people are concerned because, I've heard of other manufacturers at the moment. It was something that's just come through at the moment, which was an American company with a large fleet of cars over here. And they have just brought out some of the bigger trucks that people are buying, and they're having engine problems at the moment. One of the things is they're replacing the engines, but what was really interesting about all of that is that they've gone away from a 020 and now they're putting a 530 oil in that truck. I think that begs to differ that they're, saying, hey, look, with the conditions and where it's at, we need more protection here. And it's even from a manufacturer point, you can see that was the case. And now this is a different brand altogether, but it was really interesting to see that was the case. So it gives us more confidence knowing that the decisions we're making is the right decision for the customer. And that's essentially what I'm trying to do today, is to make sure that is the right move for people that are traveling, and that security around their cars. So very interesting around, the 020s. We knew the reason was more to do with parasitic losses and fuel consumptions, and that's something that was quite obvious. Is there a reason, I guess, when is there a time when you go up to high viscosity oils? I mean, obviously that's a variable question because it depends on application, engines and drivability and whatever else we're doing with it. But do you find and this is some of the stuff that I've analysed data from overseas and some of the UAE and so forth, and they run a 40-way oil continuously over there. Now, it's a lot hotter over there. Their winter is nothing. Their summers are extremely hot, so probably a little bit different to what we see. But when you actually look back at the weather patterns, it'd probably be something similar to what you would see, say, in Alice Springs and stuff like that with the weather patterns. Maybe not the nighttime sort of pattern, but definitely during the day, the temperatures would be much the same. So I guess, is it a big thing to do with more ambient temperature as far as the day temperature as well as the load on the engine? Because surely the overall ambient temperature of the day, say if it's continually a 40-degree day and you're not towing with it, is it still, do you think it's still worthwhile going to a heavier weight oil because of that case?
Yeah, so I think going from, let's say, a 020 to a 540 is a much more significant jump, right? Obviously, than going to a 530. So you do have to think about some of these things pretty carefully. So I would say ambient temperatures are going to affect, overall engine temperatures and therefore oil viscosity in the engine. Maybe not as much as the amount of load that's placed on the engine, right?
Yes.
So even, let's say, for example, a hot day in Alice Springs at 35 and a hot day in the UAE at 45, it's only a 10 degrees Celsius difference versus, if we're heavily loading the engine, I think that's probably going to make more of a difference, to be honest. So then it's like, what is the risk basically of going to a much heavier oil? So is there any downside? Because we know that.
I guess that's a good question to ask. What is the risk to go to a heavier weight oil?
Yeah, so more oil viscosity generally means more protection, right? As a sort of a general rule of thumb. So what is kind of like the downside risk? So in general, right, what you're doing is the engine has been predominantly designed to run a 0-20. So as an example, what are some of the changes that we'll make to run a lower viscosity oil? So one of the things that you might, as an engine manufacturer, so this would be something that Toyota would have considered, would be running lower tension piston rings, right, to accompany the lower film strength of the oil that's on the wall of the liner.
Yes.
Right?
I did see that, yeah.
Yeah, so if you start to run heavier oils, those low tension piston rings are not going to effectively scrape the oil back into the crankcase, right? As a result, you're probably going to get a lot more oil burn.
Yeah.
And so the rate of oil consumption going to a 540 is likely to increase.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, you guys have kind of mitigated that because I've seen the project that you guys are running with running a larger oil sump.
Yeah.
Right. And so that will help compensate for some of the oil burn.
As far as oil burn rate so far with what we're seeing, especially owning a couple of 300 series, we're about to buy our third one now and gone through, from what we've seen, I can't really say that by changing to a 530 oil, the first car I had was running a 0-20 for the first 12 months of its life. I can't really see any difference. There's nothing I can say. The power is still the same. Compression seems to be similar. So I guess for me, my peace of mind was, having the protection, knowing that the oil was on the higher rating and knowing that I had that protection there, especially because of what we do with the vehicle. That was important. So I guess we've established that, the reasons for why we go to a 0-20 and then coming up to a 530 and so forth. I guess, is there anything else that you think that's worthwhile elaborating on around those particular subjects as far as the 0-20, 530s or anything else in between? I think something that we touch base on, which a lot of people ask me questions, is about mineral-based and synthetic oils. And I guess that's another subject, but I think it's probably worth talking about because it's something that I see printed on every bottle. And for a long time, I had a little bit of a misperception of what that meant until you explained it to me, and I was wrong. And I was like, wow, I thought it was completely different. So I think it's worth with listeners because some people believe in a mineral-based oil or a synthetic-based oil. So if there's something that we can touch base on there, I think that would be really helpful as well.
Okay. So at a very fundamental level, the difference between mineral and synthetic, right? So mineral-based oils come out of the ground first as crude oil. So in that respect, they are a natural product, right? And then they've got to go through the refining process to turn them into all sorts of products, right? So out of a barrel of crude oil, you'll get natural gas, propane, butane, and then as it gets heavier, right, you'll start to get petrol, diesel, kerosene, and then right out the bottom, you'll get asphalts, bitumens, right? So all of these different kinds of products come out of a barrel of crude oil, including the mineral-based oils that go into lubricants. Now, how heavily those are refined then gives you the quality of the mineral base oil. Right? The way that I kind of describe it in simple analogy is imagine like a box of Lego. Yep. So, you've got your Lego set, you break it down. Everyone's got that box in their house of just like a mass of all sorts of different types of Lego. And refining is the process of taking similar chunks of Lego, so maybe it's all the red 4x2s and the 8x1s, and then putting them in piles of the same stuff, right? So we can make products out of those. So that process is never perfect, right? So you'll always have a little bit of contamination. Maybe in the 4x2 pile, I've got some of those little 1x1 pieces, right? Yeah. So that process is never quite perfect. And that's why synthetics are better performing, because back to the Lego analogy, synthetics is like if I had only 2x1 Lego bricks, and then I stack them together to make the exact molecule that I want.
Yeah.
So with synthetics, we start with something like ethylene gas, which is very, very pure, and then we build them together to make the exact molecule that we want.
So basically, it's a more refined oil over, say, a mineral to a synthetic. It's the refinery process of that. Would that be right?
So yes, but there's a catch, right? And the catch is that in the late 1990s, there was actually a legal dispute between Mobil and Castrol, right? And the dispute was over what you can call a synthetic.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
So the Castrol argument, which they ended up winning, was if I sufficiently refine a mineral oil and I do enough to it, I should be able to market that as a synthetic. So today, when you go to Repco or Supercheap or whatever, and you buy a 100% synthetic oil off the shelf,
Yes.
most likely it is actually a very, very heavily refined mineral oil.
Right,
Right?
interesting. Yep.
And below that, where you have all the semi-synthetics and all that sort of stuff, there is no formal definition of what a semi-synthetic is.
I've always wondered that, because I'm like, well, is that like half of like good oil and half shit oil? Like, how do you actually break that up? And I've always wondered between the semi-synthetics, mineral, and full synthetics. So that's interesting. So there's obviously brands out there that would do it correctly. Would I be right in saying that, as far as the synthetic oils go, that are, as you described, from ethanol and doing it that way, and not from a mineral base?
Yeah,
to start
so
with?
the number of companies that are producing, so those ones which kind of start off as ethylene, then they go to decene, and then they become polyalpha olefins. That's the name for this special kind of synthetic.
Really complicated. But
Yeah, so there are very, very few companies that now produce synthetics from PAO molecules.
Okay.
Right? And it's basically down to cost.
Yes.
Right? So if they can all be marketed as full synthetic, why put the more expensive ingredient
Yeah, so
in?
it's about sort of cutting costs to some degree to be able to get the same.
So you'll if you are going to find it anywhere, it's most likely going to be in the racing grades.
Okay.
So because they have slightly better frictional properties.
Yes.
It'll lower the engine temperatures. But generally now, if someone actually has a true synthetic in their oil, they'll advertise it as something like 100% PAO plus esters.
Right. So that's how you really know that it's the true thing, is by the abbreviations behind it. Okay, that's really, really interesting. And it's definitely good to know, because you definitely get a lot of people, and especially mechanics have been in the trade a long time, and they have their opinion based on a mineral sem or a full synthetic oil. So I think it's good to clarify what a full synthetic oil really, really is. And I guess it also shows to the consumer value for money, as far as what are they getting. And also, do they need a full synthetic? Is some of the semi-synthetics and the synthetics that, like you said, are from a mineral-based oil, do they do the job? And I'm sure if you're changing every 5,000 Ks and you're not racing the vehicle, they're going to do the job just as well. You probably might be paying, would I be right in saying you'd be paying, top dollar for an oil that you're really not getting the benefits of?
Yeah, so in a lot of cases, yes. I mean, take a look at the heavy-duty trucking market. Like, we're talking the large Cummins-style engines.
Yes.
All the big freight that goes from, Sydney to Brisbane and back, that sort of stuff. Most of those guys are running a 15W40 semi-synthetic diesel engine oil.
Yeah.
Right? And those are some of the most heavily loaded engines that we have on the market, right? So in some senses, if semi-synthetic is kind of good enough for them, it's probably good enough for the average consumer.
They have a pretty large capacity, but wouldn't
They
they?
do.
So they're running probably 20 odd litres of oil, so it's a large capacity. And oil changes on some of those bigger trucks, are they finding that the oil changes, are they regularly? I mean, a lot of their trucks are running very efficiently. They're very clean. They have a lot of filters on them. They usually run dual filters and so forth. I'm sure that's still much the same.
Yeah.
So it's about, obviously, the contamination in that oil over that distance of time and their scheduling.
Yes, that's a really good point. And it goes to the different philosophies on making different products when I speak as the oil industry, are making them. Because we also have to make the products keeping in mind how they're going to be used. Right, so let's say, for example, in the heavy-duty trucking market, most of these guys have maintenance teams.
Yeah.
Most of these guys are doing oil changes at a very fixed interval, right? So most of them are watching all of the data very, very closely.
For sure.
Right? Whereas you might over-spec an oil that's going into consumer grades, knowing that sometimes people are going to forget an oil change.
Yeah.
Every now and then, they're probably not going to treat their engine very well. When's the last time they changed
so
their
you're
oil
building
filter?
an oil for the lazy man, I guess. Or,
Yeah, pretty much.
Forgetful, yeah.
Lowest common denominator.
100%, and I totally get that. I think we always recommend, a 5,000 K service interval on a lot of the vehicles that we do. I think oil is cheap at the end of the day, considering what a motor's worth, and that's why I've always been a big believer in doing 5,000 Ks. Sometimes it's probably an overkill for, the wife running the kids to school and bits and pieces. I don't think it's probably needed for that, but I'm in an unfortunate position where having a mechanical workshop, it's not a big issue for me to change the oil every 5,000 Ks. But I do believe to protect your investment, I honestly still believe that preventative maintenance and changing those oils regularly is the best form of doing that. And I think that it goes without saying. So I guess the 300 series problems with what we've seen in the past, and there's two scenarios. One of the early days we seen one of the engines fail, and this was a car that only had 12,000 Ks on it. It had just been serviced recently by a dealer, and we seen that car pretty much fail straight away. It was a little bit unusual, and in the terms of things, that car had some extensive modifications. The customer knew he was out of warranty and it was in a bit of a pickle. I was more than willing to replace that engine because I wanted the information about what sort of had gone on. I pulled the engine apart, and the first thing I found was that the bottom end was pretty much completely seized. And it was a bit of a shock to me because at such low kilometres to see this particular problem, there was a lot of metal in there, and that's where we made it a rule. Now, any car that comes in that is in these series of cars, we are doing an oil change and an oil filter cut open as a sort of a pre-dyno inspection to make sure that everything is okay. It's something for us, a visual that we can see. We knew with that car, if we had done that process, we would have seen there would have been a catastrophic failure about to happen. But interesting enough with that, we pulled it down. It had been running dry in a lot of different areas for some time, so it sort of indicates that we've got an oil starvation problem, or there was something going on with that. I guess there's part of the story that I can't fill in the gaps, and doing an oil test only shows you so much. Yes, we know that the car had a 020 oil in it. I'm not blaming that the oil was the big problem. It could have been the fact that the car had lack of oil as well, and it was down to only around 3 litres once we drained it, so it had lost a large part of its capacity. So that could be definitely to the problem. And also, we don't know about where that car was positioned in the fact of the driving style of that car, up hills with low oil, getting oil surge and all those sorts of problems. And that could have aided in another problem. But I guess that was the starting point where we're saying, hey, is this a bigger problem? And at the time, we could see that there was the petrol variant of the engine that had problems with contamination, and they have some bearing failures and so forth. And we sort of were just keeping a close eye on that. To this day, I've only seen another one or heard another one have a similar problem with bearing failure. We have seen 2 others that have had a issue with a temperature problem as well, and these have been very loaded cars that have had an issue where the temperature of the engine has gotten too hot, and basically it's where the piston's starting to nip the side of the wall because of expansion and so forth, and that is something that's showing indication of temperature. The crazy thing about that particular engine that I also managed to get my hands on was when I pulled it down, the oil that was in it, again, it did actually have the right capacity of oil in it, but the oil in it, I have never experienced in all my life oil that had smelt quite like that. And I was quite shocked at the smell, and it was like a burnt carbon smell, like literally like it had been blowtorched. And I was like, holy hell, like how's the oil gotten this hot that it's damaged like this? And the great thing about a lot of the modern cars is that we have the ability to go in and gather a lot of data out of the car, and it shows you examples of when the car's gotten hot and so forth, and it showed us everything that we needed to know, even to the point of locations and everything else, which was really handy to understand the situation. And it was actually in this particular point, a hill that was up North Queensland, Cairns, middle of summer, and it was a range that they were travelling up at the time and pushing that vehicle. But again, I come back down to going, well, we needed to do something here to make sure that we can use the data that we're getting from all these cars that we've collected, and how do we make sure that we can put something together for the customer to ensure reliability. And I know I've had many conversations with different engineers and so forth, because I'm not a professional in this industry as far as knowing what the best thing is, but I'm definitely passionate enough to go out and find the right people to make sure I can make the best judgment decision I can. And one of the things that first come to mind was capacity. We knew that the capacity of that particular engine was only around that 6 litres. We wanted to get it back up around that 8 litres, which is what we've achieved with the sump that we've done at the moment. Adding extra cooling to the bottom of that sump with airflow, there's a whole range of stuff that we're doing there for that as well, which will help reduce that oil temperature. Changing the viscosity to go into a 530 oil, which is in line what the recommended spec is. But also, I guess it brings us to our next thing with coming through and working with someone like yourself and a chemist to be able to design an oil that is pushing, I guess, the top end of the, requirements to be a 530 oil that still meets all the requirements, but be a better oil overall. And I think we have a unique opportunity here to be able to do something and make something right. So I guess it would be good if we could talk about the understanding about what's required with the goalpost of what we have to go to. Obviously, we can't make this oil anything more than what the goalpost set, but how do we get the oil to be better than what we are currently using, say, what we are currently buying with for these cars? How do we do that?
Yeah, great question. So I think when you say goalpost setting, right, it's kind of like, what are we trying to achieve here? I think number one, it's mostly a wear protection issue, right? So it seems like, right, based on some of the experiences that you've had, that some of these engine failures may be attributable to not having sufficient viscosity, right? And we know that from some of the OEM documentation that 0W20 or in heavily loaded cases, 5W30 are sort of the go-to viscosity grades.
Yeah.
Now, you're also always trying to balance this, right? Because we want to give your customers more protection, but we also don't want to violate any of the rules around what the OEM has stated as well, right? So it's about almost like, how much can we push the boundaries here?
Yeah.
So for example, with the viscosity grades, right? Let's say you've got your 5W, which is your cold temperature performance, and your 30, which is effectively your operating temperature performance. The 5W is not going to make a huge difference when it comes to wear protection, right? Because that's really just at engine startup.
Yeah.
So once we get up to load, we're concerned with the second number, which is either going to be 20 or 30.
Yeah.
Right? So it makes sense to go to the higher number, I think. But also, within 30, there is a range, right? So if you look at it's the SAE specification for it. So SAE is the Society of Automotive Engineers. They give you an allowable tolerance of, you can be anywhere within this viscosity band and still be called
a 030.
A 0 or 5W30, right? So in that instance, it would be about, well, can we push it sort of towards the top end of that band to give us that additional wear protection, while at the same time still staying within the rules, for want of a better word, right? So there's that part of it. The second part of it is, okay, that's effectively the base oil and the viscosity. What can we do on the additive side that, again, still within the rules, but we can give that extra kind of added protection? And so a lot of that will be starting with a product that we kind of know and a product that works, right? And you have to stay within the bounds on things like sulfur levels and phosphorus levels. So it's, okay, can we push the margins a little bit on things like anti-wear? So that would be your ZDDPs, as well as your molybdenum style additives. Okay, can we push the boundaries a little bit, still staying within the rules, right, for catalytic converters and DPFs and all that sort of stuff, but give just a little bit of an additional boost, right? Now, one of the reasons why even just a small change can give you a marginally better result is because of something which I call lubrication maths, right, where the real maths that we do in the real world kind of gets violated. So in the real world, 1 + 1 = 2, right? Sometimes in lubricants, 1 + 1 = 3. And by that, I mean, if you have, there are certain additives that work well together, and we call it synergy, right? So if you have zinc, it might give you, let's say, +1 on your anti-wear. Molybdenum also gives you +1 on your anti-wear. When you have them combined, though, the result is +3.
All right, you get an extra one.
Yeah, just because of the way that they work together.
Yeah, it gives it a boost.
And so it's about playing with some of those relationships to give us just that a little additional performance boost.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's awesome. I'm actually excited about the journey that we're going through to sort of go down and really understand about the oils and then come out with an oil that we can sort of back and push. Something that was mentioned that we'll also hopefully get the oil tested by, is it ALS?
Yeah. Oh, sorry. ALA. Yes.
ALA?
Yeah.
Sorry.
So ALA is the Australian Lubricants Association. Right. The confusion there is that ALS is Australian Laboratory Services, right? They're the guys who test your oil samples. So ALA, the Australian Lubricants Association, was set up a couple of years ago to act as like an independent body that can effectively for the industry to self-police itself. Right.
To make sure everyone's obeying the rules, sort of thing.
Yeah. And one of the reasons is we want a certain degree of consumer protection. So the intent in going through this kind of testing exercise, the ALA calls it VRF, which is a verification exercise, is to get the oil tested with the ALA, who will use an independent third-party laboratory to confirm that it meets all the performance requirements as stated.
I guess that's what I'm more passionate about, is then showing the consumer that we've gone through the right procedure to test it to make sure it is. It's not smoke and mirrors. It's doing the best that we can with what we've got.
Yep.
And that's something that I think is really cool, and I'm stoked to be a part of it. I guess, so we're coming to the end of the video. Building oils, obviously this is your thing, it's what you do. Does it bring some sort of excitement to you to be able to be a part and with your knowledge be able to push boundaries a little bit and be able to build, oils that you want?
Yeah, this is, for me, this is fun. Number one, because I think I mentioned at the very beginning, I usually play in the industrial kind of world.
Yeah.
Right. So getting to experience something which is actually going to affect consumers.
Yeah.
Right. That's something that's novel for me.
Yeah.
Right. And I really enjoy that. And it's, I think, going to be a different experience solving customer issues that are, it's not going to be for a corporation. It's going to be for mums and dads who want to enjoy their weekends. Right.
Yeah, for sure.
So that, I think, for me is pretty exciting, and getting to see, that sort of feedback cycle.
Yeah.
That for me is really encouraging.
Sure. Yeah.
So that's what kind of excites me about the project.
Yeah.
And I think it's not only that, but this whole kind of YouTube ecosystem,
Yeah.
if you like, where it's like the consumers can almost bring their problems sort of like direct to the fore.
Yeah.
Right. So that, I think, is also something which is a little bit unique.
Well, it hasn't really been done before, and that's the thing. And that's what I think it's great, is being able to tackle problems head on, and not obviously go through other avenues. And that's what I find. That's what I love about, I guess, the technology nowadays, is that it allows us to do that.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to say thanks very much for taking the time out of your day. I know it's been a big day for you, and you've come here and you've given us the time to explain to our consumers about what you do and all about that oil. I'm sure we're going to have many conversations in the future about all of this. So I look forward to working with you, and again, I appreciate your time.
Yeah, no,
thanks
appreciate
for coming
it.
today.
No, thanks very much. Really enjoyed it.
So that comes to the end of our Stay Tuned podcast. Big thanks to Rafe for coming on and going through this process with us and really give us an understanding of what oil is all about. Hopefully you enjoyed it as much as I do. And if you have any questions into oil or anything to do with oils, please feel free to give us a call, and we'll try and answer your questions as best we can. Obviously, we're going to have some more videos coming out and explaining more about the oils and the development around that. But in the meantime, please like, share, subscribe, and look forward to seeing you next time. And stay tuned.